Well, thank you very much for bringing me all the way from Singapore, Liz. I too have enjoyed thinking about this subject and writing a little. Though when she told me very fiercely that it has to be 15 minutes, I said, "Okay, well, a lot of bucks per minute." Okay. It's also very, somehow I find it very fitting that this is taking place in the Center for European Studies. I mean, the tables will finally be reversed. And the uh, let me first say that Liz has done very well in putting me between, she obviously knows, between Ram and Shaoguang because, and later on Tam Tai because, the bad way to look at it is that I'll cover a lot of the same ground that Ram did, but the good way is that hopefully we can transition. Okay, the first thing, actually, thank you, Ram. I mean, you laid a very nice foundation and put forward some very interesting ideas. The first thing I want to say is the whole sort of appeal of socialism and how it developed in Asia at the beginning of the 20th century, or certainly actually before, in fact, if you want to look at the prehistory, is before the Russian Revolution, and you had all forms of anarchism and so on that people like Arif Derlich have studied for China, and to some extent in India as well. Before the 1917 revolution, and that is an important history. But the crucible in which socialism developed was one that also included nationalism. So the appeal of socialism is mixed in with nationalism and a wider sense of universal justice. This is what, in fact, makes the new type of anti-imperialist nationalism very different from earlier forms of social Darwinist nationalism that existed in the world. And there was something parallel happening with the socialist movement, socialism and nationalism in Europe as well. We're talking about Kautsky and the Second International and all of these kinds of things. But in Asia, this was a very important crucible. And we can just have to look at the May 4th movement in China, where it was principally a nationalist movement, but the anti-imperialist basis of it very strongly developed into a socialist, wider socialist, not just communist, not just Marxist sort of sense. And here, I think it's important to understand that the socialism is associated with a sense of universal justice, of making nationalism something much more important and sort of reaching to certain types of transcendent goals. Nehru had a very interesting comment on this, where he says what does he say? Yeah, that socialism makes nationalism more progressive and international, making people into citizens of this wide and fascinating world. It was, I thought, a very interesting comment that Nehru makes as well. But for me, the best example of this is Ho Chi Minh, who has in an essay called a very short lecture called "The Path That Led Me to Leninism," he shows very clearly that he admired Lenin first and foremost as a patron of Russia, of the Soviet people, then as a liberator of colonized people, and then on to socialism and communism, and then these three elements become inseparable, right? And that's the crucible that we find. That's the matrix that we find throughout the 20th century in Asia, more than anywhere else, I think. But I may be wrong on that, probably in the Latin America and Africa too. So this is, and it becomes hard to separate. And although it began as a sequential pathway, it remains simultaneous, and the rationales are also mutually interrelated, they're interpenetrated. So you cannot separate one from the other easily. So one of the most interesting things in China is, how they do become separated, nationalism and socialism and things like that. Nationalism is bound to anti-imperialism, which is bound to universal justice via socialism. Now, we find this also sort of, somehow it's harder to find in the Chinese case in the same way, but when you read something like On New Democracy of Mao Zedong, I think that there is a very close interpenetration of the understanding of nationalism and socialism and the ultimate appeal of social justice. There, it's treated much more sequentially as in traditional Marxist thinking, but it doesn't have to be, and I think it goes back and forth. I want to make another point to add one more element into this matrix that I've been talking about, and that is the idea of an alternative civilization, particularly in places like China and India. That this is also because, the classic, especially after World War I, classical sort of European civilization is identified very much with social Darwinism, having lost its civilizing mission and so on. But at least in Asia, that's the feeling, and a lot of places in the West as well. But this also becomes the opportunity for these anti-imperialist national movements to develop sort of the idea of an alternative civilization, choosing the best of their traditional civilizations, which were not aggressive and competitive and things like that. I mean, you can see it very much as a. In fact, that was predominantly a conservative appropriation, but also had very strong socialist elements. And it's interesting to explore how and why this comes around. Of course, it was absent, we think, in the Marxist socialist movement in China. But I think it's very interesting that someone like Mao Zedong had his fierce, fierce debates, or at least critiques, of someone like Liang Shuming. Liang Shuming was somebody who founded the idea of not socialism, but of reconstruction of China on China's rural roots and so on. And this was something that Mao felt not threatened, but he felt was an alternative. And I think we can also see this sort of larger civilizational perspective in Mao's notion of world leadership, right? It becomes very important, especially in 1950, once they come to an agreement with the Soviet Union that we are going to be leaders of Asian revolution and things like that. So there is a civilizational dimension. It's more embedded and implicit. It's much clearer in India, where I think Ram has shown us that Nehru was somebody who, Nehru and Gandhi were two different faces, but I think we can see this matrix in both as well. What for Nehru is in his discovery of India, clearly we have an appeal to a lost civilization, right? The basic narrative of discovery of India is that India was great in its ancient period. Since then, it's been losing out. And how do we sort of restore it? And he had a very strong admiration of all civilizations, that is the Chinese civilization. I mean, that is there all the way through. I mean, he was a true cosmopolitan in this sense, and he was the true alternative civilizations man. But of course, this was all mixed up with his great admiration for socialism as a doctrine in particular. In Gandhi's case, we don't see an explicit socialist. There, what you have is much more peasant civilization, rural culture, Ram Rajya, the kingdom of Ram, or the god Ram, this Ram, doubtless, the latest incarnation, and rural self-sufficiency and so on. That was the basis of his critique. But of course, as we know, and this is our great overlap, it's the Gandhian socialists who I think have made the most important interventions at a subliminal level in some ways, at a political subconscious, I think. The two most important Gandhian socialists from the Indian heartland, and this is a place that we call, the cow belt, the North Indian cow belt, regressive in every way. But they're the ones who sort of produced, I would say, two of the most important indigenous socialists. Okay. And they are Lohia, whom Ram mentioned, and Jayaprakash Narayan, whom we'll just call JP for the moment. Ram has told us a lot. One of the things that Nehru also captured very well in his distance from the Soviet-type Marxism, and something which then these socialists provided an alternative to, Nehru said that the Communist Party of India is completely divorced from and is ignorant of the national traditions that fill the minds of the people, right? This is something, of course, that Mao was able to bridge both dimensions, but the Indian communists were absolutely not. And this is what the Gandhian socialists were able to do. And here, Lohia, you've heard, had rural national dimension of socialism. He was both anti-capitalist and anti-Marxist. He regarded caste as a kind of an overdetermination of class, but you could not pretend that it was just class, right? JP, I think, was in some ways the more important person. I think JP's has a model of rural development, and he had a very strong anti-autocratic sort of trend. And this was, of course, most clearly in that he was the greatest leader of the anti-emergency movement under Indira Gandhi from 1975 to 77 or something like that. Anyway, and in other words, he's somebody who's able to use socialism, link it to two notions of universal justice, and link it back to certain types of transcendent claims. And here we have, of course, the programs that they develop in rural self-development government and so on. In particular, the Panchayati Raj, that is the village system of self-governance, and many other. I think sometimes these kinds of rural socialists are poo-pooed in India. So people have told me, they're not important, they didn't really have an impact, and so on. But in fact, if you look at a lot of both the government programs and policies, much of it is based on this kind of thinking. The very establishment of Panchayati Raj, one of the most important developments in India are these watershed development projects all over, which is they're very much participatory grassroots level organizations, which may not be as efficient and effective as much more mobilizatory ones, right? This is the difference, I think. This is not a mobilizational socialism as much as it is a participatory one. And they are much less efficient, I think. But you see that the leadership really comes out of, and they're almost like messianic figures. They're almost, people like Anna Hazare and so on, who are appealed to by these NGOs who engage in these watershed development and other kinds of NGO participation things. And finally, I think that the most promising leader in India today, and he, I don't think, has a Swiss bank account, is Nitish Kumar, the Bihar chief minister, who came directly out of the JP movement. And I think, and he is certainly has, if there's anyone with any moral cachet in Indian politics, it's him. And he has managed to achieve great effects in this way. So anyway, I have 2 more minutes. Let me just say that I think in China too, so this is the effect in India, I think, the socialist traditions. And you have to go through a different route than to come through traditional Marxism. I agree with Ram here. In China, I think there's still also very important survivals of socialism, and not just in the rhetorical mode. I think one, and I'll only mention one of the most important one is the fact that despite an effort to change rural property laws, you still have property is still owned by the collective. And what the farmer has is the right, or the migrant labor still has use of the land right. And that is a very important development because it allows the migrant to come back to the rural area to make claims on whatever develops out of there, whether it's a TVE or some other agribusiness that is moving in. And this is something I'm working on very centrally now. But I think it provides the kind of floor which develops out of the older pattern of institutional socialism in China that continues to be important, and an important sort of motivating force as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.